What's up, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. Dreamland again today, chapters 12 and 13, I think. They're pretty short chapters. It's a really good book. I'm about 3 or 4 chapters ahead, and I apologize. It's taken me a little bit. It's been a lot of time in between episodes lately. I've been very busy at home, so forgive me. We're on page 68, chapter 12, Just a Phone Call Away, Portland, Oregon. In his 40s, Alan Levine lost both legs to frostbite when he fell asleep drunk under an overpass in an Illinois snowstorm. Somehow he survived this, and in time he migrated west, ending up in Portland, Oregon. He was already a longtime heroin addict. Levine first used heroin at age 20 in New York, and that first shot made him feel the way he wanted to feel the rest of his life, like the king of the world and the president of everything. All his life, Alan Levine loved drugs and the charge they gave him, but his lack of legs got in the way. He shuffled around on prosthetics. Usually, he procured dope from some old house where he had a connection, or by wandering around Old Town Chinatown neighborhood north of Portland's downtown, an arduous trek repeated 3 or 4 times a day. Levine hobbled along, driven by his addiction. Each time, he never knew what he was getting, or whether he would be robbed or arrested. He'd make it back to his motel, fix, and zone out until it was time to go look for more, surviving on panhandling and a monthly disability check. In 1993, Levine returned to Portland after a year away. He heard that dealers had come to town who now delivered dope if you called in an order. Somehow Levine got their business card, though years later he couldn't remember precisely how. He had never known of a heroin dealer with a business card and a convenient number you could call. With that card, well, Alan Levine might have just died and gone to heaven. Wayne Baldessare, meanwhile, was sure he was entering hell. Baldessare was a cop who loved dope work. He'd been on the Portland Police Drugs and Vice Division since 1982. He loved the creativity the job required, that he had to use to care for informants. Each day was different. An undercover buy in the morning, a search warrant in the afternoon. The job required imagination because the dealers were themselves endlessly creative. For years, heroin was the easiest drug to work because it was sold out of houses. You arrested a junkie. Terrified of withdrawing in jail, he'd tell you how the dope house worked. The junkie would bring an undercover officer to the dealer, then you busted the place. But in about 1991, Baldessare saw all that change. Young Mexican guys, clean-cut, courteous, and looking quite out of their element, were driving around town in old cars delivering heroin. All of a sudden, you got a dispatch center taking orders and calling these delivery guys, he said. It made it very hard to get a good case. You were looking at hours of surveillance for 5 or 6 small bags of dope. The delivery drivers did tours of 6 months and then left. If they were arrested, they were deported, not prosecuted, because they never carried large amounts of dope. The cases were always light. Baldessare first figured they were small-timers. Later, he realized that quite the contrary. They had learned how drug investigations worked. Prosecutors prized cases with large quantities of drugs. Crack and methamphetamine were priorities then, each measured in kilos. As camouflage, these Mexican heroin guys used just-in-time supplying, like any global corporation, to ensure that they had only tiny quantities in their cars or apartments. This, too, was sophistication Baldessare didn't see in the heroin underworld. Soon these delivery drivers crowded into Portland. Heroin prices dropped, and Baldessare watched the drivers get wise. They drove in circles to lose their officers following them. It took 4 or 5 officers to tail one car. Up till then, Portland hadn't had much of an aerial police service. One officer owned a 4-seat Cessna and charged the city for gas when he used it for police work, which was not often. Now the airplane was pressed into regular service, with a pilot and observer watching the heroin delivery car on the street below. Baldessare was the observer. Peering through binoculars from above, he radioed locations to his colleagues on the ground. It was grueling work and went on for hours. Baldessare was one of the few officers who could peer through the binoculars from the plane as it went in circles without getting airsick. As the drivers tooled around Portland all day making deliveries, Baldessare spent 10-12 hours a day in the plane, watching from 2,500 feet in the air, stopping only to refuel. This was before GPS, nor were there cell phones to track. It was line of sight, he said. If you looked away, you could lose 'em. So you picked your times to look away. If your neck was getting a kink in it, you had to choose when to massage it. Above downtown, Baldassare could follow a heroin car for a half circle of the plane, then lose it behind a building as the Cessna completed its circle, hoping to pick up on a new go-around. Cars easily got lost under Portland's dense canopy of trees. Before long, the department had to expand its Air Force. An Air Force was a luxury most police departments the size of Portland's can't afford. But with this new heroin system, it made it necessary. The city hired another 2 pilots. Finally, the development bought a new plane with full-length windows for easier surveillance. Their business card was yellow. It had a phone number and an eagle with a snake in its talons, the emblem of the flag of Mexico. That was all. No names, no slogan. Call any time, Alan Levine was told. One night, he did. "Give us 20 minutes, said the guy on the other end of the line. To Levine's immense surprise, within 15 minutes, a Mexican kid was knocking at his motel door. He was young and nervous and clean-cut. He looked like a farm boy. He spoke no English, but he had $60 worth of black tar heroin. Levine had never forgotten the first rapturous feeling he got from heroin back in the 60s. But through the years that followed, he also never felt that high again, until, that is, he shot up black tar heroin that night. Levine called the number 3 times a day after that. The delivery guys changed often, and he called them all Pedro. They were reliable. They arrived quickly. Now, instead of having to brave Old Town on his 2 fake legs, Alan Levine could sit in his motel room aware that he was, quote, just a phone call away from getting loaded. The Mexicans were the only dealers Levine had encountered who never ran out of dope. In time, prices dropped to as little as $5 a hit, as these crews brought huge supplies of high-quality tar heroin to Portland and competed against each other, yet he noticed that they never feuded. They gave him credit. They often gave him a little extra, avid to keep him as a customer. One night, one of these kids, a driver as Alan Levine remembers it, tried to scam him, offering 18 balloons for $100 when the deal, already long established, was 25 balloons. Levine objected. "Let's see what the boss says," the boy said. Levine got in his car and followed the driver across Portland. They came to a house. Out came a man Levine years later determined to be Enrique Tejeda Cienfuegos, but whom he came to know as El Gato. Tejeda Cienfuegos was from the village of Aquiles Cerdan, a few miles south of Jalisco. He and his 4 brothers ran a heroin franchise in Portland. Levine knew nothing of this. He only knew that the delivery kid was trying to screw him, and he explained this to El Gato that night. The boy now produced the 25 bags of heroin, saying in Spanish that this is what he offered Levine the whole time, and there had been some sort of misunderstanding. El Gato was apologetic and gave Levine those 25 bags of heroin for free. Levine never saw that driver again. El Gato was evidently powerful, Levine remembered, when I spoke with him in a motel room near downtown Portland one night many years later. I tracked Levine down through his ex-wife because by then I realized the history of heroin was best told by addicts. The older the better. I sat in a chair for a while he, legless, sat in his bed, smoking constantly. Cigarettes gave his voice a growl, as grizzled as his face, and a strange chop to his jaws that sounded when he spoke, as if he were chomping down on a juicy steak. Sure enough, he knew the story of the Jalisco boys' arrival in Portland as well as anybody, even if he knew them only as a rotating series of Mexicans that he called Pedro. When I showed him a mugshot, he definitely remembered El Gato. "When he spoke, they acted," he said. "He had some status. He took a liking to me because I paid on time. After that, they'd come and say, 'Gato said to give you this. Gato said to give you that.' They called me Liver because I told them I had Hep C, and I didn't want to share the needles." El Gato later gave Levine a buck knife, perhaps feeling he could use some protection. Levine realized he was worlds away now from how heroin had operated for so long. You didn't have to leave your house. Dealing with those people was paradise. You could nickel and dime them, too, when they got there. They were eager for green money. Levine had never known any dealer to give away free drugs to get people hooked or to keep addicts from getting clean, the kind of mythical pushers the government and the media had invented amid the dope fiend scare until he met the Jalisco boys. This marketing technique was about that. They knew what they were doing. They were marketers. Enrique Adrift, a rancho in Nayarit, Mexico. The morning after Enrique's big homecoming party, following his return from Canoga Park, his mother was happy and his father held his tongue. California gave Enrique a new option. If his father mistreated him, he'd just leave again. So they ate together as a family and tried to forget past misery, now that their new northerner, as they called him, had come home. The problemas between both sides of his mother's family grew worse. The shootings didn't stop. Most of his grandfather's relatives had to leave. Relatives of his grandmother dominated the barrio. But Enrique felt his experience up north elevated him above this petty world. He spoke to both sides. He could think of nothing but California. His life would be different, and this, he believed, was entirely due to El Norte and heroin. Yet, he still only had a skinny horse that he thought looked more like a dog. His California sojourn had left him a little to offer his girlfriend. He wanted a rematch with California. That's how he looked at it. A test of wills. No one would use him again. His uncles, he saw, made some money and then backed out of the business for a while for fear of village gossip. Enrique was more afraid of poverty. Other kids were now going north the way he had. The retail system that the Jalisco immigrants were devising in San Fernando Valley allowed even the humblest to do more than just dream. It was also ending his rancho's dismal isolation. For years, when cars passed through, villagers would hide, fearing it was a child kidnapper. Girls covered their faces when someone brought out the first video cameras at a party. But as men went north to sell dope and returned with money, they brought with them a feel for the outside world and an enhanced vision of what was possible. Everyone would have his own business, be his own boss. The Jalisco heroin system was a lot like the United States in that way. America fulfilled the promise of the unknown to rancheros and an escape from humiliation for Mexico's poor from villages just like Enrique's. The Jalisco heroin system did it faster. Plus, it was risky, and this beckoned farm boys who saw that they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. By risking a lot, they added to their status back home. After a few months, in about 91, one of Enrique's uncles called from the San Fernando Valley and offered him work with good pay. This time Enrique arrived confident and brash, proud of his worldliness, no longer the scared village kid. He saw immediately why his uncles had called him. More heroin dealers from Jalisco had followed the lead of the pioneers and crowded into the San Fernando Valley's already proven market. Competition intensified. Prices were dropping. By this time, the families who would make heroin their lives' work were established in the valley. Of course, David Tejeda and his brothers were there. Beto Sanchez and the Sanchez clan were growing big. So too were the Beto Bonk and his family, as well as the Bernals. The Lung Garcias, brothers Julio, Chuy, and Tino, whose father was a witch doctor back in Jalisco, had cells, as did their cousins. The Garcia Lung Garcias, Poya, and Macho. There were others as well. One family had Pasadena to itself. Each family had 2 or 3 cells going, and each cell had at least a couple drivers working shifts from 6 a.m. to noon and noon to 6 p.m. every day. At night, they met at apartments and rolled heroin into balloons for the next day. It was not a glamorous business. You were there to work, said the family bosses, who paid each driver $600 a week and wanted every hour accounted for. The job of heroin driver resembled sweatshop work. The cell owners changed the drivers in and out, moving them into apartments and out again in 6 months later, switching cars even more frequently, and ordering drivers to hand out beeper numbers to junkies on the street, along with free samples. By the early 90s, the San Fernando Valley was like a convention, a reunion of people from Jalisco County. Everyone wanted in. One dealer, known as El Gato, from the village of Aquiles Sardan, was especially aggressive. El Gato didn't care what people said about him back home. Enrique admired that. El Gato wanted people to know that in his house, hunger was a thing of the past. El Gato came home with clothes, cars, ice chests full of American beer, and guns of various calibers. El Gato is everywhere, and it won't be easy to run him out, his uncle had said. His uncles promised Enrique more money and a new truck in Mexico if he did well. With another driver, Enrique, properly inspired, patrolled the streets of the San Fernando Valley like the state trooper he once wanted to be, now looking for addicts. He'd give them a free sample and a phone number. Within a few weeks, Enrique raised the daily take to $5,000. Then, early one morning, police raided an uncle's house. The other uncles had looked to this man for leadership. In the weeks that followed, Enrique saw his remaining uncles falter. Gang members robbed their drivers, and they did nothing. Several times, clients put knives to Enrique's throat. He spit the balloons into their hands, remembering a saying that his father had told him, "Die for what's yours, but not for what's others." More people arrived from Jalisco to sell the chiva. The heroin networks multiplied. El Gato's workers began leaving him to start their own cells. There wasn't much El Gato could do. Any retaliation in Canoga Park would cause issues back home and bring the LAPD's attention. A friend Enrique knew from Jalisco came up and started his own network. Just started the cell right there in the valley. Then El Gato surprised everyone. He took a junkie in Chiva and opened a heroin cell down in San Diego. Before long, Enrique heard El Gato had one going up in Portland as well. David Tejeda had that score going in Hawaii. These kinds of moves rocked the Jalisco heroin world in the San Fernando Valley. Above all, they showed the Jalisco boys that they could find new markets and that the system would succeed far from Valley's Nayarit enclaves. Enrique, a kid of 16 now, watched all of this. As the business floundered under his uncle's weak leadership, he and a friend bought a car and rented an apartment on the sly. For a while, without his uncle's knowledge, he ran his own heroin tiendita on the side, but then a gang member robbed him, took his dope, and cut him. His uncles discovered his side business. They beat him for his temerity, gave him $1,800 as payment for his months of work, and packed him off to Nayarit. With that, the one escape from a life of sugarcane farming seemed closed to him forever. His return to the rancho was greeted less enthusiastically this time. His sisters smiled at the gifts, but he felt their disappointment. He had no other options. He went to work again in the fields with his father, who smirked and mocked him. As if to show up his son, his father installed a satellite dish outside the family shack. In Mexico, or Mexican ranchos at the time, satellite dishes standing 15 feet high were one way a family showed the neighbors that it had arrived. Didn't matter if some days it got no reception. The towering pole and broad dish made a statement. His family had no decent bathroom, Enrique wryly observed, but it had a satellite dish. Still, his father was happy, so the family was relieved. One day, the land would be his father reminded him. Enrique should get used to that idea, but even that was years away. Without heroin, Enrique couldn't imagine a life where he controlled his own decisions. Harvest time came, with heat and humidity that felt like boiling soup. Enrique had 50 pesos a load trucking the towering stacks of cut cane to the mill, in the fields from 3 a.m. to 6 p.m. The heat sapped him, his legs buckled, and he arrived home every night looking like he had been tossed in a bag of charcoal, thinking to himself, "I'm leaving my soul in these fields." So we'll do the next 2 chapters in the next couple of days, guys. We're on page 76. I hope you guys are enjoying the book, and it looks like these next 2 are pretty short too, so it should be 2 chapters in the next episode. Keep fighting that good fight out there.